Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today, we'll be speaking with Bonita Lee. Bonita is a social worker in a high school. She is a passionate, compassionate service provider for students and families and is a stalwart advocate for the well-being of historically marginalized students. Please welcome Bonita Lee. Thank you so much for being here, Bonita. For our audience, could you please tell us a little bit about who you are and what is your connection to public education?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me first. Second, my name is Bonita Lee. I am so excited to be here. I am a community connector. I'm also a Black author, and me and my significant other, we created a space for other people who identify as Black and Brown. And we are doing that to help increase information in our community. My connection to education has been the last 23 years. I believe knowledge is power. I have worked in K through 12, as well as the community college level, as well as at the university. And so my last 23 years, I cannot leave education. I keep leaving and coming right back. My heart is with high schoolers right now. My current role, I'm doing social work in a high school, which allows me to connect with families, students, and the community.
So 23 years of experience is some time, plus obviously your schooling experience. With that perspective, what is the purpose of public education?
I love that question, and I'm going to answer that in two parts. The first part is the original part of public education was for us to be able to develop a productive workforce, right? We wanted to create informed citizens and provide social mobility through education throughout our country. Although I do not believe that has benefited a lot of our marginalized groups, that includes our BIPOC population, LGBTQ, AI, plus our refugee or immigrant students, and I do not see that impact truly develop for our ELL students either. So with that being said, that was originally what it was supposed to do, but I think that it leaves out a lot of our marginalized youth because we're missing key components. The first component that I want to bring up on my second point is representation matters. We need to be matching the demographic of our students. When our students walk into a classroom and they don't see themselves reflected and they don't have people that understand their culture, when they come into that space, it is very hard for them to use education as a tool to take outside of 12th grade education from 13th grade on. And so I believe that was the intent of the education, but I also believe that it left out a large majority of the population in our country today.
So that makes me think about just that kind of common perspective of intention versus impact. So there's this intention, but what's the actual impact and actual result? I'm curious, though, whether representation or another example of what's working from your experience, what have you seen actually support ELL students or refugee students or BIPOC students? What have you seen really work in our systems? And, really the next question is like, how do we do more of that?
Well, and yeah, I love that question. I also want to point out that education, when people have access to education and are able to use it the way it was intended, even though it excludes a large population of our the people who represent our communities and our culture and our country, education is supposed to reduce crime, improve health, and really give students the opportunity to understand how our political system and civic system run, right? So how I've seen it work well is even if the teacher does not represent the student and the majority of the population in that school, right? The majority of the population in the school I work in, 74% of it is brown. So even if they don't, I see a lot of wonderful impact when we try to create generational connection. So we ask the students like, hey, what is it like at home in this scenario? Or what did your grandparents do? Or what do you plan to do that your family already has? And then we can contribute that to math, to science, to the electives. Like when we can show them how this knowledge directly brings in their community and brings in their culture, there's a lot of impact that's made. A lot of the things that happen at my school and on my campus that I'm very proud of is one of the things that stands out is multicultural night. We could have 3 to 4 generations at one night.
Mhm.
And of course, as a parent, we want to know what our students are doing. We want to know what they're doing well. We want to know what they're excited about. And so if we give our students the opportunity to share their personal experience and make a connection to math, make a connection to science, make a connection to social studies, then they're able to bring their whole self in the classroom and they're able to break down those barriers and actually shatter that glass ceiling that so much so plagues a lot of our students.
There's a concept by Tara J. Yoso called community cultural wealth. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it sounds like essentially harnessing that familial capital as a school building.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So how do you help folks feel welcome, even for parents that may perhaps did not have a great experience at school, or immigrant parents? This is really a foreign experience and there's an element of fear or not feeling welcomed. So how do you bring that intergenerational familial capital in? How do you really help people feel welcome by the institution?
Right. And I think that is something that we still need to work on. But the things that I have seen work, being a child and family advocate, especially in ECAP, which I don't know if you're familiar with ECAP, but those are our really littles. They're like 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, and they're starting their education off early. And they're usually come from a community that doesn't have a lot of resources and fit the economic scale of lower economic social status in our region and in our communities. And one of the things that I found out is when you go to the home and you let them know you're coming, but you go to the home and you make sure, that if you're going to certain homes, if there's shoes outside, take your shoes off. Don't ask. Don't wait for people to ask you to take the shoes off. If they offer you something and, if you can take it because they're offering you what they have and they're showing you that they're welcome. And then making sure that, and not every teacher, not every educator has this, but there's people who can do this work, right? There's counselors, there's family and community engagement people, there's family liaisons that do this work. It's all part of the system of education where we're knocking on doors and we're inviting, and then we're finding one family. My best example is I don't know about you, but our parents who have students in sports, they got this down. There's usually 2 families in sports that you could tell one thing to a coach and it'll go to all the family members, right? That is the model that we need to use to let our families know that you are welcome, that we want you here. So how do we take the lived experience of our parents and bring that into our community? And there's many ways if we just decolonize the way education was constructed in America.
There's this intergenerational component, and I think about how our culture, our contemporary world is, and we're kind of like boxing up our young separately. We box up our elders separately, and they don't meet, right? When historically, throughout all of human history, the elders and those littles, right? When that baby is like, why? The elders are like, let me tell you why. And often the parent kind of generation is off doing the things of that adults do. But it's really interesting to me how we separate those 2 populations in our contemporary world. So to me, that's like structurally, how do we even engage these two generations, which are naturally, I think, they can go hand in hand, right? So that's where that's leading me. I'm curious about other challenges that you see in education, to representation, to family connection, and then how to overcome those. But what are you actually managing? What are you dealing with on a day-to-day that you want to see resolved?
I feel like I just had 15 students in my office, and I meet with a lot of the seniors, and I try to tell them, this is your year. This is your year to make the foundation for a launch. I call senior year launching pad. This is your launching pad. And a lot of the students are like, I don't know when I'm going to use all this information. And so there's this cognitive dissonance of when am I going to use this science? When am I going to use all of this math? When am I going to use all of this social studies? Like, when am I going to use it? And so I feel like a lot of the things we need to do is we need to restructure the pedagogy of teaching so that students who are, first of all, students now are born with a phone and an iPad in their hand. Like, that's not our generation. Not saying we're old. I'm just saying that was not our generation. We did not have cell phones at school. I did have a pager back in the day and thought that was great, but you still needed a payphone with some change to call somebody back. So making sure like we are using the technology to show students how relative this information is to their launching pad. There is a complete separation. A lot of times I'll see teachers that make great connections with students. They'll use music to break down different things in the community where they'll be like, well, when this song is actually talking about the loss of a loved one, where this song was talking about in the height of the civil rights movement, they needed people to band together. Well, this one, and like when they are able to grasp it and see it and have a dialogue with it. One of the things that I was telling the love of my life the other day is, adults, we have mastered we give you information, now give it back to us. Mm-hmm. But we have not mastered what do you already know and how do we receive that? And that's really what we need to do. We need to see what they know and we need to be able to connect that to where they're going. And I don't think we do a good job of that. I don't think we give them a voice. Like, I am all about uplifting student voices. They are brilliant if you give them the opportunity to tell you. But most of the time, we're just like, sit down, listen to this lecture, take the test, you pass the standard, go. Yes, I know there's RCWs. Yes, I know they have to have the Spanish. Yes, I know. But how do they get that information? We can do better at presenting it that way. And I get it. Teachers in high school, they can see 150, 300 students a day, right? But how are we presenting that information where students are in my office saying, how am I going to use this? What am I going to do with that? That has nothing to do with my career path. Like, I'm going to be a mechanic. I'm going to be a pilot. Why am I in botany? Like, and so how do we show them that education is a tool that will sharpen them in many areas of their lives, not just their career track? And then how does that spill over to parents, right? Some parents are great. They have time to be hands-on. And some parents are working 2 and 3 jobs trying to make ends meet. So how do we ask them to give up time for them to make money to contribute to the household? It's like a balancing act, right? We want to invite our families, but we also do things right after school. And a lot of times parents are working, or what if they work swing shift or the night shift? And so how do we have opportunities for our students and our parents that are all throughout the day, right? And how do we make it all fit? I feel like we're one piece to the puzzle. And sometimes we put that puzzle together, but all the pieces aren't fitting correctly.
So I'm hearing 2 themes really, like relevance, and there's a whole tech question here. As you mentioned, like I didn't grow up with a cell phone at 12 years old, laying by my bed, as I go to, I don't know what that's like. And I'm grateful I don't have that. I'm grateful I did not have that. There's something about it seems overwhelming. It seems really kind of I don't know. It seems, overwhelming to me. There's like it's bombarding the minds, right? So if our young people have these devices, it's part of, as digital natives, right, as I've heard them called, what are the actual uses? Instead of it being something we fight in education, how are we actually inviting that in and utilizing it for their learning, as opposed to we see it as strictly a problem?
And I think that is vital. I just had my mom, also an educator, she was informing me that they did a study somewhere, I want to say in the South, about the students turning in their phones at the beginning of the day, and how after 2 weeks, students were saying, wow, I didn't realize how distracted I was. I didn't realize that I was checking Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram like every 5 minutes. And now I don't have that pressure, but yet on breaks or whatever, they get their phone back. And so I think that I think that you're right. And I think that as a society, we have lost the beauty of stillness.
Mm.
I think we've lost it.
Even just mentioning that pause moment. My sister's an MSW practitioner, yogi, and even she just recommends just take a pause breath for classrooms, for clients.
Yeah.
I'm curious your perspective, especially as a social worker. This to me leads me to SEL, right? This component,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
what I hear in the kind of job world. I went to a conference last spring, and they're talking about durable 21st century, aka soft skills, that employers are saying our students just don't know how to be people with people anymore. So there's this element of just human engagement, but there's also how do I manage, cope with, deal with hardship in terms of a social emotional learning capacity. I'm curious what your experience, especially as a social worker in a high school, what do you notice about this, I guess, human area of learning in being in community?
Okay. So, I always tell my truth. So this is one of the things that I'm very passionate about and I push back on all the time. So I want it to be known that I love my teachers. I know you have standards, RCWs. I know that. But I often challenge teachers and say this: when you are a person of color and you enter a room and you do not greet your elders, you are considered disrespectful. So when we ask students just to come in, sit down, and be quiet, it's a whole cultural shift that they have to make. It is code switching at its finest. If we just allow students to humanize the first 2 minutes of class, then redirect them, they're going to get that social interaction and get it out. So they're not trying to pull out their phone, text each other, do a Snapchat real quick. They have time to humanize and connect. And I love when I go in the classrooms and I see a question on the board. It could be as simple as, hey, what's your favorite cereal? All the way to a deeper question of, what did you hear about on the news in the last week that you really have an opinion about and would like to share? But if we allow them to have that social emotional connection with their peers and with their teachers, I feel like it'll bridge a gap, because there's holes in the bridge, right? There's a bridge between teachers and students, but there are holes. All the information isn't getting to one or the other because of all the other things that we have to do in the classroom. And I keep telling people, at the beginning of the year, we do great at getting to know our classes. We do. We have the four corners exercise. We have the team exercise. We have drawing exercise. But how do we implement that in day-to-day instruction, even if it's 2 minutes, so that we can keep the connections with the students and so that they have something to look forward to? I always say this. I say, I want somebody to do an experiment. If you've seen it, Vincent, tell me. I want to know if people do a social emotional connect every class period, if their students are tardy. I want to know. Because most students I know, if they know they have a chance to connect with the teacher or their peer, they're not going to be tardy to that class in particular. So if we have issues with tardies, my question is, what is the first 5 minutes of the class engagement outside of taking roll? Because that's where our SEL and that's where our connection is. And so we use SEL, our PBIS team, and all that in high school. I'm sure you're familiar with all those terms. And when we get the information out about what we're doing, what are expectations, we also talk to them about like Hispanic Heritage Month is coming up September 15th through October 15th. That information goes out there, as well as different lessons, right? But how do we bring that into our classrooms every day? And so for me, I have, I call it the hype you wall. Every time you come into my room and every time you come into my office, you have to read a positive quote in the mirror to yourself before we begin whatever we're there to work on. And I do that because a lot of times when people come to see me, because I'm doing social work, it's a heavy reason. I mean, there's things, needs and stuff, but sometimes it's a heavy reason, right? I'm checking with my foster care students, seeing how their placement is, seeing how we can help and support. I want you to come in and I want you to read the affirmation that I'm wonderful, that I'm fierce, and that I'm beautiful, and that I have something to give this world. And I want you to do that in the mirror, and then let us begin the work. If we just engage students where they need to be engaged, I feel like a lot of the things with discipline and tardies and just technology, I feel like if they could engage right away, right? I feel like we wouldn't have all those issues. It would help.
You make me think about like dosage. So even in this, what I hear in that is like a little dose of self-worth, a little practice that's going to engage, and you actually have a mirror there for them to see themselves. It's not just something they're, saying in their mind, but they're reflecting themselves. We depends on where you are now. I know it's being challenged in some places, but I grew up with the Pledge of Allegiance every day. And so that few moments where I literally put my hand on my heart, where else do we do that in our life, let alone, school? But what a symbol, right? What a physical, my hand on my heart. I could probably walk into any supermarket or mall USA and just say, I pledge allegiance and start. How many people could join me? What's the impact? It lasts a lifetime, right? So these little dosages every day, whether at the beginning of the class, when they come to your office, I'm curious what the impact would be if we were practicing this K-12, like if we got it for a whole educational experience, this reaffirming of self, this self-love.
Right. And what that would look like. And I feel like, this is like, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like social media, depending on the algorithm and what they pick up, if you watch one thing that's maybe not so positive, that's what's going to be on your feed. So if we start showing students positive things, that's what's going to show up on their feed, right? And even if we ask students, I like to ask students different things when I'm like, hey, I need you to bring your favorite quote. And they bring their favorite quote. And sometimes people are like, wow, that was deep. And I'm like, right. But it always tells me where to start with them, right? Because you can't start with a student without a foundation. That's why we do so much social, emotional, and SEL stuff at the beginning of the school year, because we have to make a connection with students before we can start teaching them. And so I feel like that's what we need to do throughout our lives, not just as students, because I feel like we're lifetime learners. I know you and I are both lifetime learners. Like, we will never stop learning, but we need to implement that into society and for our students. I think it would be amazing if teachers were able to do the same connect before they started class.
Yes.
Like, I love the grounding that you do. What if you get to school at 7:30 a.m. and then the administrator or the office person was like, all right, teachers, let's start. All right, staff, let's start with our grounding today before we see students. And we just do, like, wherever you are, like, you can lean on the wall, sit on the ground, if you're in your classroom, just do a grounding before we start our day. How would that restructure us so that we can show up and give our students 100%, because we know that some of them are coming in with 5. Yeah. Like, part of having an educational institution work for our students is showing up for our educators as well. And I know that's a cliche that you can't pour from an empty cup, but honey, that's true. It's true.
But I think what you're talking about is short, right? 30 seconds, 60 seconds. We don't need a lot of time. We need a lot of intention.
Yes. Say that again. You don't need a lot of time. You need a lot of intention. I think you should write that down and put that somewhere too. I also think that we need a power shift. Really, education needs a whole power shift, a structural shift. Like, one of my favorite quotes ever by Ms. Shakur is, no one is going to give you the education to overthrow them. Nobody is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes. If they know that knowledge will help set them free. The problem is we are so interested in controlling students that we forget to pour into what's already inside of the student.
If you had a call to action for folks listening, what would it be? Would it be in this area of relinquishing power, inviting student power, inviting familial power? I'm curious, what are your calls to action?
I think my first call to action is simple. Listen to students. Listen. If you don't know how to do circle, Google how to do circle. Like, one class period a week, Fridays. You want your students not to miss Fridays? Have Fridays be a circle day where all of the desks are in a circle. And even though you're doing instruction, everybody can see everybody. Let's humanize. So my first call to action is listen to students. My second call is, it's also very simple. When you see that we are not making impact, it's okay to reevaluate. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It doesn't mean that you're not doing enough. Sometimes we need to be vulnerable enough to say, all right, I think I need to reevaluate. I think we need to reevaluate a lot in education. And I've talked about many things that we could do and change and aspire to be, but really evaluate at the end of the day the 2%. 98% might be engaged, but what about the 2%? What about the people that the students I was talking about in those marginalized groups? What about that? Are we trying to reach them? Are we asking them to show up authentically who they are? Are we asking them to code switch because we don't understand that students have a norm in the building and a totally different norm most of the times in the household? How do we invite all of the students there? So my call to action is, let's move in a way where we have the mindset where we invite the whole student, culture, language, customs, all of them into the educational system and not require them to be robots. They're not robots. They're literally our future leaders of tomorrow. They're not robots. They're not just students that need to understand information and give it back. Because I will never forget, and they're popping up everywhere on social media. I'm a writer because my third grade teacher told me. I am I played this instrument for an orchestra because my teacher told me in seventh grade that I'm good at this. Let's aspire to have those moments with every student. If you can't think of nothing else, you got to figure out a way to compliment every student. It could be as little as, hey, I saw that it was hard for you to get here on time, but you made it 3 days in a row. Like, let's go. Like, how do we interact like that? Let's humanize with our students so that we can make the most impact. We only have them for a couple years, y'all, and then they're adults for a long time.
But you said leaders of the future who are going to have to solve some significant problems they're inheriting. Wow.
Oh, yeah. And that's why I have issues when people talk about youth. This is not horrible. When people talk about youth, I'm like, oh, the problems that your parents made? And they just look at me. Okay. Like, and the way that we talk about youth, I always like caution people, wait a minute, because our generation didn't do it all right, neither did our parents or our grandparents. So who's the problem? Really? Because these students are your children. So they're a product of your household. So are you talking about yourself or are you talking just about students? Like, and they're like, oh, Bonita. And I'm like, whatever. Like, it is what it is. They didn't get here by themselves.
Thanks. I've been wrapping these interviews up with this final question around your actual lived experience. How did school impact you personally? Were you in the K-12 system? What was it like? And what's the impact?
So I think that this is a great way to end, but I think it's going to have a lot of questions that I don't have to answer, which is going to be great. My parents put us in Montessori very early on. Like, my parents are educators, PhDs, master's degrees. They understood that knowledge is power, right? And my mama always said, and I quote her, the 2 things white America did not want us to do, you will do. You will become educated and you will own land. I was like, yes, ma'am. Like, I was told that from age 6, y'all. Nowhere I was owning land back then. But I remember I was in school, and I'm going to give this example, and then I'm going to answer the last question. I was in a school, and I was 6 years old. And I remember my teacher was a white lady, and she didn't like me. And I didn't know why she didn't like me. But I remember the first time she said a word and students were just like laughing and pointing, and I didn't know what the word meant. So I went home and I told my dad, I was like, hey, Dad, what does this word mean? And my dad had this look of fear and shock because I feel like my parents did a great job of sheltering me and my brother in the beginning of our lives. And my dad looked at me and he said, I'm going to answer your question, but first I need you to tell me, how did you get that word? And as many of you will probably know, I'm talking about the N-word. And I told my dad, well, my teacher called me now and everybody laughed, but I don't know what it means. So my dad grabbed his keys and grabbed me and put me back in the car. And he began to explain to me the history of America to a 6-year-old, and how that word is not who I am, and that I'm not ignorant and I'm capable of learning, and that he's going to show me what I need to do from now on every time I hear that word. And I remember getting out the car and my dad taking me back. And I remember my father starting the sentence with, my daughter is 6 years old. By the end of the conversation, I realized that I would have a new teacher. And then I wasn't ignorant and I wasn't stupid and I wasn't dirty. I was 6. So my education started off rough because a 6-year-old asked a question. So they had to become a racial slur. And then with that, being embarrassed because the rest of the class was laughing and I had no idea why. That impact could have steered me one or the other way. And I always tell my dad, I'm so glad I told you and not mom. Because my mom would have went from 0 to 60. I was 6 years old. But my dad showed me very, very well from that moment how to always stand my ground, no matter what people call me, no matter how ignorant they are, and no matter how much history likes to repeat itself. I don't have to claim it. Fast forwarding to my educational career, my parents actually would not allow us to go to public education and we went to private school. After that experience and an experience my brother had with his administrator if I'm in kindergarten, he was in 3rd grade. And he had a similar experience with an administrator who was standing over him and yelling at him and telling him he'd never be anything. My parents decided that they were going to do it the private school way. And a lot of people ask me, why do I work in public education? And I tell them this, because I don't ever want a student to experience what me and my brother had to go through ever again. My experience was not good and it was short-lived because me and my brother both had a negative experience within the same year. My brother's a few years older than me. But I could tell you this, all my friends that went to public school would always be at my house. They would always be doing my homework with my parents. It was like my parents had like a cohort after school. It was crazy. Everybody would meet up there, do homework, and then we had various sports. So the foundation for my education was rough. I remember starting Running Start. I was 16 and a half, turning 17. And I told my mom it was the first time I found my people. I loved being treated like a human being and not just a student. When you do Running Start, they expect you to manage your behavior, to participate in the class, and I thrived in college. So much so I was able to get a free ride to college with the academic scholarship and use that to become who I am today. So I could say the beginning of my educational experience was rough for me and my brother. But it got better and it can get better. And like my mom has told me my whole life, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. And that's why I work in public education.
Thank you for that. That's really impactful, that to protect you, it sounds like these experiences you had in public ed, your parents chose as educators, chose something different for you all. It's really powerful. I'm just noticing I'm really experiencing kind of a deep sadness because I believe deeply in public education. There's something about this access for all to me that is critical to our democracy. And I also know the history of our system has harmed so many.
Right. But I always tell people this, although I was harmed and my parents had to shelter me, they had to. I realized that the years I was younger, our society did not have as much change and change agents as now. There are people like you, people like me. There are teachers doing the work, breaking down like the status quo and the norm. And so I see that there are people that are challenging and making policies and trying to erase what people are literally trying to erase in our history. And I could see that we're in a fight, but I could see that there's more arms linked together in that fight than there were when I was a child.
Yeah.
And so I totally believe in public education. I believe that everybody should have access to education. That's why I don't work at a private school. I work in a public high school, right? And nothing's wrong with private or public, to be honest. But the access you have, and economically for our students, right, and our household, public education is there. But I always say this, Vincent. I hope that students experience more good than harm? And I cannot answer that. That's an individual question.
Thank you. Earlier, you spoke a little bit about representation, and it's very hopeful how you're ending and say, there are folks, right? There are folks in this fight. They're advocating, they're devoting their careers to justice and equity. When we talk about representation and books available for young people, I know you're an author of that book. I'm curious, what motivated you to write that, and what have you seen after it's being published?
Thank you for that question. Vincent, I'm going to tell you, just like that 6-year-old little girl who didn't know what to do, Go On Little Sister Go On was birthed out of that little 6-year-old little girl. I had my first civil rights era in 2020. And as I sat down and wrote the book, Go On Little Sister Go On, telling all these Black and brown girls, like, you are not good at one thing, you are good at everything. There's 21 different girls depicted in one book doing 21 different things as an anthem of you could do anything. And I always told myself when I was older that I had to make impact. And this book has created so much impact with not only our little girl, but parents reading this book to their children, and not always brown children and little boys, and letting them normalize seeing Black girls and brown girls as the protagonists in a book is making so much impact. I got a text message, a Facebook message from a mom who's a little girl. She's an Afro-Latina, and she said, my daughter reads your book every day before she goes to school. And she will not let me leave. She sits on the stair and reads your book. And there's a little girl in there with curly hair just like hers. And you can see the little girl. She said, Mommy, she looks like me. Mommy, go on, little sister, go on. As tears are rolling down my face, because I didn't have that accent. I didn't have representation in a book where I could turn that page and see myself being a skateboarder, a boxer, in addition to a ballerina and a cheerleader. And so I feel like I want to help lay the foundation. And you know my favorite quote, it's in my book. It is stronger to build. It's easier to build strong girls than to repair broken women. So my anthem to them is, you could do anything, you could be anything. And honestly, go on, little sister, go on.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your sharing.
Thank you so much.